Wolfgang. Hello to everybody who's joined us. Welcome. Next up on stage, we are going to be hearing from the Mastercard Economics Institute's Chief Economist, Michelle Meyer. Please give her a warm welcome.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Wonderful to follow Wolfgang. He set the stage beautifully in terms of the importance of data. So I'm going to pull it back a little bit, keep on the theme of data, but talk about what it means today as we look at the economy. And the point I want to make and leave you with is that it's very easy to talk about the economy in one full swoop, to try to use big terms. Is it strong? Is it weak? Is it feeble? The reality is that it is diverse, that there is not one uniform story when you talk about the economy. And that's really important, and it is important particularly for me in this seat at Mastercard, because we are looking at the economy much more on a micro level. You have to pull that micro story from that macro story. You can do that on an income level. You can do that by education. You can do that by location. And we do that day after day as we try to understand the trends in the economy. So with that, let me unpack a few things here. Let me start with a few key themes about what we're seeing in the economy. The first one, which if you're attending some of the IMF meetings and the discussions, you'll probably have heard this term, US exceptionalism. And it is true, relative to a lot of other economies, the US economy is defying expectations. It's growing faster, it's more consistent, but again, it's not uniform. The second one is supply side changes, which have been quite meaningful in terms of transforming our economy. And that comes in part out of the pandemic. You had supply chains adjustments, you had people relocation, new technology, dislocations, maybe in a better way. You've also seen, very importantly in the US, but not only in the US, but also globally, a lot more participation in the workforce. A more hybrid workforce, maybe better job matching. So there's certain things coming out of the pandemic on the supply side that have been favorable. And finally, importantly, and this is what I'm going to focus on with the charts, and I will bring data into this, I promise, is preferences and behavioral changes. The pandemic shifted priorities. That's, again, in terms of where people are living, where they're spending, how they're using their time and their purchasing power. And what we've seen is coming out of the pandemic, initially people want to buy stuff, goods. Increasingly, they want that experience in every way. Experiences how they shop for those goods, but also experiences in how they're deploying their dollars. So let's go ahead and dig into that a little bit more. And for that, I will use some data here. Thank you. So we've done a few things here in the Mastercard Economics Institute that I find to be very fun that I wanted to talk through to you that really highlight the preference changes and the changes that we're seeing in terms of how people are spending. So the first one here is what we just saw in the US, the total eclipse. And what we were able to do in real time is to look at how people traveled to see the eclipse around that path of totality and how much that influenced spending trends. So what you'll see here in the map is highlighted that path. And when it's more red, it means even stronger spending, a little bit more white, a little bit less, but all of those areas saw an increase in spending relative to trend. So you can look at the right-hand chart. Let's focus on hotels, right? As people traveled and then went and actually stayed over to see the eclipse. In New Hampshire, right, there was a 729% increase in spending at hotels during the point of the eclipse, during that day before the eclipse. Illinois, 316%, Maine, 240%, meaningful. Dining, what did we see? Maine, 103% increase, New Hampshire, 98%. Fuel, people got in their cars, they drove, they traveled. 26% increase both in Maine and New Hampshire. Those were the states that really stood out. What does this tell us? It's obviously very cool and it's fun and we love looking at this, but it tells us some really great things too, which is that people can travel, they can spend. They're intentional, they're careful in how they're doing it, but they have that demand side strength because the labor market's been strong. And that feeds back into small towns, small communities, and creates a real nice lift to a lot of those economies that otherwise would not have seen that. What else are we seeing? Americans are traveling more than ever. So it is partly because of the dollar strength, which I'll talk through, right? So there's some good economic reasons for that, but it's also some preference changes. So if you first look at that right-hand chart in terms of the time series, you'll see that we're about 20% above where we were prior to the pandemic in terms of the number of people who are out there traveling. Where are they going? Europe is a big destination, right? If you think about those summer trips in Europe, it's happening. Very, very strong growth. Mexico is another one. We saw that was one of the first areas, Mexico, Dominican Republic, that we saw Americans go back out and travel coming out of the pandemic. It's still happening. And I'll point out one other one that I think is quite interesting. You can see Asia, not yet back up in terms of where we were previously, but when you dig deep, within the continent, it's Japan. You are seeing a lot of travel from the US to Japan, and you can probably thank the strong dollar for that. So people are back out moving, using their purchasing power. What about into the US? A little bit less so, we are still missing about 15% of the tourists that we had prior to the pandemic, but you are still seeing a lot of movement. Where are they coming from in particular? Where have you seen the biggest growth in terms of travel into the US? It's from India. So if you look at this chart here, you'll see the bars are where we're seeing travelers now. The gray is where they had been prior to the pandemic. So when you have a blue here in this direction, it means there's more travel today from that country than there was prior to the pandemic. So most countries, it's below. India is the one that really stands out as above. Japan, the opposite story holds, where in Japan you are seeing that blue line where we are now, arrivals into the US significantly below. Again, the dollar has something to do with it. COVID dynamics have something to do with it. So lots of different stories by location, by geography, but people are back out experiencing and spending. Now, very importantly, going back to the idea that nothing here is uniform about the economy, what I just painted is a story of an empowered consumer, and that's true, but not everyone has that luxury. Not everybody has the ability to get into their car and spend on fuel and spend on hotels to see the eclipse or to travel the world. There are necessities that have increased in price, whether that's thinking about food prices that have increased, shelter prices that have increased, and they have consumed more of the budget for a lot of folks. So one of the things that we're working on now is trying to understand certain dynamics like this, which we're relating to specifically access to public transportation. So what we show here in this map is a way of trying to understand how what's called transit deserts, locations that do not have the infrastructure for public transportation, influence how dependent consumers are on fuel. And the way we proxy that is the really red areas here are where you're seeing, less fuel dependent, the more yellow, white are more fuel dependent. And that's as a share of spending on fuel. And it makes sense, and it's very highly correlated to those transit deserts. So it's important to have that flexibility to be able to deploy your purchasing power as you see fit. There's certain dynamics that do need to be in place, and this is certainly one of them that's very important to pay attention to, not only in the US, but of course, also globally. So I hope you enjoyed those charts and that data. I certainly enjoyed sharing it with you. And with that, I'll go ahead and welcome back Wolfgang, and we're gonna have a bit of a chat about what we're both seeing.